All right, in this video, I'm going to walk you through a stupid, simple way that I healed my PTSD without therapy. And I helped over 2,000 other trauma survivors heal as well. So I'm going to walk you through first the three components for healing PTSD. And then I'm going to walk you through this mental model down here. So this video is going to give you the overarching methodology on how to address and solve any of your mental health issues and any of your traumas. And I know that sounds bold, but this stuff really does work. All right, so the three core components for healing are your current situation, where you are right now, your desired situation or your goal, where you're going, and three, the problem that's preventing you from achieving that goal. So in diagram form, I'll map it out here. So in this lower circle, this will be where you are currently. Up here at the top, this will be your goal or your desired situation. And then these circles along the way, along this path right here, are going to be your problems, or we could call these, in the case of PTSD, trauma. So I'll label these as T's, as in trauma. So like trauma 1, trauma 2, trauma 3. So overall, this is what your recovery journey looks like. Down here, this is where you're currently starting, and this is where you want to go out and just list out where you are. What does your life currently look like? What are your current characteristics, your current habits, your current coping mechanisms, your addictions, everything right here. All the things that are currently plaguing you that are causing your PTSD. This will make up your current situation right here. And your goal, you also want to go through and you list out exactly what you're aiming for. And the clearer that you can get on your goal, the better. So these are going to be, again, characteristics, skills, emotions, family life, how you want to feel, so that you have a clear before-after picture that you're aiming for. So you know where you are and where you want to go. But even though it's simple, this is something that I never saw or did in any therapy session or anything else. And this really is the prerequisite to making any sort of progress forward. You need to know where you are and where you want to go. And it's just like a GPS. The very first thing that any GPS does is it identifies where you are, right? Where you currently are. The next thing it does is it figures out where you want to go. And then from there, it's able to path the most efficient route to the goal, aka the destination. And our brains work exactly the same way. They are goal-striving mechanisms. And without a goal and without knowing where you are, there's no way in hell that you are going to be able to map or make any progress at all towards that goal. So as simple as this sounds, this is imperative to have. And it's something that I see most people not do. They're not aware of all the things that are affecting them day to day. And they're definitely not aware of where they want to go. So those are the two prerequisites right there, is defining your current situation, defining your desired situation, where you want to go. And then the next thing are identifying the problems along the way. Because inevitably, you're going to be here at your current situation, making progress along this line, and then towards your goal up here. And then you're going to run into a problem, which in our case is going to be a trauma, right? So when you boiled PTSD recovery down into its simplest forms, it really is just a massive problem that we need to solve. And then that massive problem can be broken down into smaller and smaller problems. But you won't be able to progress past this problem until you solve it. And this is where most people get stuck, is that they just keep running into that first problem again and again and again and again. They don't know how to solve it. So I'm going to walk you through this simple method on how I was able to solve every one of my traumas. And this is a simple framework, a simple mental model that you can use immediately with any problem that you're experiencing. So think of anything right now. It could be a symptom. It could be a relationship problem. It could be a personal problem. It could be anything, literally any problem that you have. It could be a specific trauma. I want you to think of that as we're going through this together right here. So the very first step that we have here is we take the problem here and we input it into this first step, where we do a root cause analysis on this to identify the root of the problem. And the way that we do that is by asking one simple question: why? We don't just ask why once, we ask it again and again and again and again and again, literally as many times as we need to until we identify the root of the problem. And we know that we've identified the root of the problem when there's a big spike in emotion. Typically, we are very detached from the root cause of the problem because our minds repress the problem so much because it is so painful, but there's always signs on the surface of that underlying problem. So in the beginning, we're not really conscious of the cause. We're typically conscious of the effect of the cause, if that makes sense. So the effects being the symptoms, habitual thoughts, negative beliefs, things like that. Those are things that you are easily aware of in your conscious mind. So to really identify the root cause, we have to dig deep down into your subconscious. And we do that very simply, like this is very simply put, by asking why again and again and again and again and again. And as simple as it sounds, it really works. You just have to go down, you can write it down on a piece of paper, write down your problem, write down your symptom, and ask why. Start exploring to seeing where that comes from. And it'll start bringing up different painful memories, different painful beliefs. And you will know, like deep in your gut, when you find that root cause, because it'll just smack you right in the face. Like there's no way that you will not be able to tell that you found that root cause. So you do a root cause analysis by asking why as many times as you have to. And I typically call this the 5 whys. And then once you identify that root cause, when you identify the core of that pain, the next thing you do is you ask how. How do I solve this? And sometimes that the how is an external action. Sometimes it's an internal action. And external actions, they're easy to understand and explain. They're things that you do in your physical environment. There might be a certain action, a certain boundary, removing a certain trigger from your life, whatever it might be, some kind of external thing that you do. But internal actions are a little different. And when it comes to processing trauma, there are really 2 core internal actions that you can take. that'll really determine the how. And one is emotional and the other is logical. So these are really the two actions that you can take and the two, let's say, quote unquote, hows, internal hows that you can take as potential solutions to the root cause that you identified. So emotional actions are really a release of emotion from your body, and logical actions have to do with your thoughts, changing thoughts, identifying and changing and challenging beliefs. But these are the two possible actions that you can take there, right? And there's obviously so many different ways, permutations, methodologies that include these two internal actions, but at a first principle basis, again, these are the first principles of, let's say, internal action that you can take. So you ask why, you identify the root cause, and then you ask how can I solve this root cause? And what you'll do is you'll come up with different hypotheses. You don't just come up with one, because at this point, you don't know what the solution is. You can hypothesize about what possible solutions might be to this problem, but ultimately you don't know. So you have to run a test. You have to have a scientific mindset to actually solving your own problems. So you come up with these different hypotheses, right? So you come up with as many hypotheses as you can. And then what you do is you test these one at a time. And what you'll find is that a lot of them will fail, but one of them will succeed. And the cool part about having a scientific mindset like this is that you are so detached from failure or things not working. And I know a lot of people, when they are processing trauma or just going through life, one of the biggest problems that they have is dealing with failure. But if you switch your mindset from I have to be perfect all the time and I have to get the answer right the first time to a scientific mindset where it's all about hypotheses and discovering what works and what doesn't work via trial and error, then you will eventually you will stay persistent enough to actually find that solution to your problem. And honestly, this is how I was able to cure my PTSD in 18 months. This is how I was able to help my partner at the time, who had the worst PTSD I've ever seen, CPTSD I've ever seen, how we're able to solve her flashbacks, her nightmares, her panic attacks, her seizures, literally everything that she went through. We were able to solve through this very, very simple mental model here, where we have our problem, we ask why to identify the root cause, we ask how can we solve that root cause, we hypothesize here, and then we actually test it again and again and again until we find the winner. And when you find the winner, what happens is that this problem is completely solved. You've unlocked this bottleneck, so you never have to deal with this again. And then you get to move on to your next problem, right? Where you'll run into your next roadblock, but you'll go through this same mental model down here, the same framework to solve this problem. And when you come up with the hypotheses and test them, you will unlock this next level right here. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is when one problem is actually chained and connected to another problem, where one problem is actually dependent on another problem to solve it. Because when you have one problem here, it's very easy to solve, but real life isn't easy and trauma isn't easy. A lot of times trauma comes with other problems attached to problems. You know, problems that are dependent on solving other problems. And before I get too complex or too deep into this concept, just know that I'll explain it very clearly and I'll give you a very simple example. So there are some problems that are dependent on other problems. So I call these dependencies, where you have one problem here that's dependent on another problem, and that you can't solve this first problem up here without solving this problem down here. So for this example, I'll call this T3.1 and I'll call this T3.2. So here's the example. So let's say that one part of you wants love and connection, but the other part of you wants safety. And the part that wants love is dysfunctional and chasing abuse, right? So they're searching for love in all the wrong places. The safety part, it runs away from the abuse. It sees that the abuse is bad for you and wants to pull yourself away from that abuse. And this is a very, very common problem and a very common dynamic where you have one part of you that's just craving love and will do absolutely anything for that love and connection, typically because you were deprived of that love earlier in life. But then you have this other part where it's like, this is terrible for me. Obviously, me being in this abusive relationship is bad for me. So you have these two warring parts inside of you where one of them, all they want is love and connection. And they will do absolutely anything just to get a shred of love in their life or connection in their life. And that's why they keep putting themselves into these abusive scenarios again and again and again. But then you have this other part over here, that safety part that sees all this and is pulling in the opposite direction. So you really do have these two warring parts that are pulling against each other. And I drew this as a chain here, but really these parts are just pulling away, one pulling towards love in this example and one pulling towards safety. And this is why you see a lot of people in abusive relationships stay in abusive relationships, but two, have multiple failed attempts at leaving that abusive relationship because they have these two parts pulling away. And it very much is like a yo-yo in that relationship where one moment you're being pulled in, you're sucked into the relationship, and another moment you're trying to escape, right? But then you're pulling back in and out constantly because you have these two parts within you that are pulling in opposite directions. So to solve one of these problems, we need to solve the other one. This is where dependencies come in, where you have two problems and you need to solve both of them in order to solve any of them. You can't just solve one side of the equation because you'll never find safety if you never solve the problem that you're having with love in the first place. Now, to solve a problem like this, we need to make sure that we're getting the love need met. Truly, we solve that problem and why this is happening, and we solve and meet the need of safety, right? And we do that by taking this same methodology down here where we have the problem, we ask why, we identify the root, identify how, come up with hypotheses, test those hypotheses, and then come up with a solution. But the difference here is that we're solving two problems instead of one. This is just an internal dynamic that you want to be aware of when you're solving problems to ensure that you're able to see other parts together and solve them. Now, there's one last thing here. Now it's possible to have a third part or dependency, or even a fourth or a fifth part. And this is where things get complex and where mapping out the traumas and really mapping out what's there, which I'll do another video on, but it can get very complex very fast. And this is why a lot of people stay stuck. But in this case, an example could be shame for letting yourself get abused, right? So then what could happen here is, let me delete this. We could have another problem down here chained to this, T 3.3, right? So we don't just need to solve 2 in this case, we might have to solve 3, and again, might have to solve 4. This is where it gets complex, but if you map out all the problems like this and you're able to see the connections between problems that, oh, I have this part that wants love, but I also have this part that's fighting against the love part that wants safety, and then I have the shame part that's also pulling away, then I can see all the parts that are connected to this initial part that I saw, use the problem-solving framework, solve all of them in tandem, and then unlock this next piece here to achieve our goal. And really, that is what recovery looks like, and this is exactly what I did to fully recover as well. Now, what happens when you reach your goal? You're not done yet. The next step here is to keep going. So after you achieve your goal here, your goal now becomes your current situation. Because most people, they'll stop here, they'll achieve the goal, they'll stop, and they'll stop growth. But what you're going to do is you're going to keep going, right? You're going to keep going. You're going to cast out a new goal, identify the new problems along the way, solve them, and continue to level up again and again and again and again and again. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, make sure to hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.